So the second talk of the day is by Teresa Kouri Kissel, that will speak on a relatively different subject, pluralism in proof theory. And I think that the student already met Teresa yesterday, and correct. And some of you already met her in the lunch. So I think that is all what I would say. I can add that the first time that I met Teresa, we were in a conference where she was presenting a talk explaining that Carnap was not a pluralist, and I was presenting a talk explaining that Frege was not a logicist. So we were considered the two crazy speakers of the conference, and so we become very good friends because of that. Okay. Teresa, go.
Yeah. For what it's worth, I've since learned that Marco is clearly the craziest of the two of us. So. But it's always nice to meet a fellow outsider, perhaps. Okay, this talk is super different from the last one. Hopefully, just as interesting to y'all. We'll see. Yeah. So it's going to be on logical pluralism, right? In particular, it's going to be on a notion of logical pluralism that's gotten via a proof theory. So I said a little bit. Well, sorry if y'all were there yesterday. This might repeat a little bit, at least at the beginning. But the idea with logical pluralism is that there might be more than one good logic out there, right? So often, or at least historically in the literature, folks are after like the one true logic that's got some sort of like a priori features to it. It's the thing out there that our deductive reasoning ought to aspire to. More recently, people have sort of second guessed that, especially if we want logic to apply to all domains of reasoning, or if we want logic to carry some sort of normative force, you might need more than one of them to get that sort of picture off the ground. This is a controversial thesis to begin with, but we're just going to assume it today. So we're going to start with the assumption that we get some sort of logical pluralism. In particular, we're going to start with a picture that Restall paints of a proof-theoretic logical pluralism, and I'll tell you more about that in a few slides. But the proof-theoretic logical pluralism that Restall presents can't accommodate any sort of reasonable relevant logic. I argued that in a paper in 2016. And so the pluralism we're actually going to focus on today is one from Ferrari and Orlandelli, who talk about this notion of balance as involved in any sort of proof-theoretic pluralism. This is going to come out as this notion of harmony for them. But what I want to show basically is that I think that they're largely right, except they didn't kind of go far enough, right? There's room for even more pluralism on their part. Right. So we can loosen some of their notions of balance. They have this definition that I think can be loosened. And then we can sort of play with the notion of balance more generally to get us more good logics onto the picture, right? And that's what I'm going to show you how to do today. Cool. So while you just saw the introduction, I'll tell you about the debate thus far. So the Restall paper, my response, and then Ferrari and Orlandelli. I want to talk about the ways we can alter the definition of uniqueness, and then the ways we can alter the definition of harmony or balance, depending on how we think about it. And then I want to sort of circle back at the very end. Ferrari and Orlandelli have a certain set of requirements for their logical pluralism that they base on some earlier work from Beal and Restall. So same Restall, but with a friend. And so I just want to show that the system we develop here still meets those original 3 requirements of that system. And then we'll wrap up. So on to then the debate thus far. Okay. Okay. Restall's proof-theoretic pluralism is based in a sequent calculus. So sequent calculus is a logical system we can set up to track relationships among sets of sentences, right? So, we've got a sequent. I can't point to it, but that's okay. Y'all can see it. We've got a sequent, right, gamma turnstile delta, where gamma and delta are sets of sentences. And we're going to read that as saying that every evaluation which takes every element of gamma to be true takes some element of delta to be true. So if you've got an evaluation where everything, each sentence in gamma is true, you know at least one of those sentences in delta is going to be true as well. This in the end is going to come back. This is the thing that I'm going to pick on in that 2016 paper that's going to cause problems for us all, but we'll get there. Right? We also get a series of rules. Okay, I'm going to ignore identity and cut for right now. They're going to be important in a second. But importantly here, each connective comes with some left and some right rules. Right? So we've got these rules for moving, basically, I don't know if this is exactly the right way to think about them, but I like to think about it that way, for moving sentences across the turnstile and what happens to those sentences when we so move. Right? So the negation L rule, for example, shows you how you can introduce a negation on the left, right? And that's, so if we read it the way Restall does, right, and we're looking just as at negation L, we've got if everything in gamma is true, then either A or something in delta is true. What does that tell us? Well, if everything in gamma is true and A is false, then something in delta is true. Or I guess I should, it's not that A is false, but it's not the case that A is, that's too complicated to say. It's good enough for us that A is false, right? On this picture then, the left and right rules for a connective are going to give the connective its meaning, right? The not L and not R rule are exactly the thing that define negation for us. They don't just define it, they like imbue it with meaning or something like this. This is a super common way to think about these things, right? It's a really common inferential picture to take. In the case of and, obviously we have three rules because the L rule splits to accommodate for each side of the conjunction, and the same for or the R rule splits to accommodate for each side, but it's a similar sort of picture, right? So each of those rules is going to define the connective that it's associated with. What we then get on top of that are identity and cut, and there are some other rules in the offing too. These are what are called the structural rules. They define the, I don't know, there's lots of options out in the literature. You can think of them as defining the turnstile. They tell us how the turnstile works, right? They tell us more information about how the logical consequence relationship works than about any individual.
So what tells us how the comma works?
This is a wildly complicated thing. For now, we're just going to pretend we know. Ferrari and Orlandelli are going to change it up a little bit because right now, the comma looks a little bit like an and on the left and a little bit like an or on the right. These are very sort of classically imbued notions of the left and right of a turnstile. There's ways to do it with like an intentional and an intentional or. There's ways to think of it. There's all this work on like bunches now when you don't even, there's lots of options. I'm just gonna shove that under the rug.
Yeah, because I was saying, like, thinking when you said the rules for left negation and right negation define negation, but that assumes that you already read the comma on the right as an or and the comma on the left as an and.
You have to.
Otherwise, you could do exactly the opposite. You could say, "Oh, I know what negation means," and the rules define what the commas mean.
Yeah, you totally.
So, like, I was just wondering, if you want to really use proof theory to explain the meaning of your connectives, there seems to be a little circularity.
Yeah. Yeah, and so, but that's a problem for Restall. It's not a problem for me today. But you do have to start out with his interpretation of the sequent before you can move on to using this to define connectives. That's definitely true. And then there's different motivations you can think of for the interpretation of the sequent itself. But yeah, so for Restall, then the identity rules and cut rules don't constitute the meaning of any connective. They're not connected defining, right? And so here's a cool thing. Well, I've just said that. Right, here's a cool thing you can do, right? And this is what Restall does in that 2014 paper, right? You can obtain different logics by varying merely the structural rules. So you can mess with cut, for example, or things I didn't show you on that slide, right? You can mess with what are called the weakening rules. So the weakening rules let you add a sentence to either side of the turnstile, right? So if you've got, which one of these was working? Gamma turnstile delta, you can also get gamma A turnstile delta. Why is that? Well, if everything in gamma is true implies that something in delta is true, then if everything in gamma is true and A is true, you've got the same clause, right? And you can do it on the other side too, because if everything in gamma is true implies something in delta is true, then everything in gamma is true implies that something is delta is true or A. In the paper that Restall describes, he generates different logics by restricting the number of sentences that it can appear on one side of the sequence. So if you restrict the number of sentences on the right-hand side of the sequence to 1, you get a constructive logic, it's intuitionistic. If you restrict the number of sentences on the left-hand side of the sequence to 1, you get something called a dual intuitionistic logic, right? This is really cool, actually, and it's a really neat way to generate pluralism. So one of the reasons that the Beal and Restall book made waves to begin with is because they had a pluralism where you could argue that the connective meanings remained fixed across all of the admissible logical systems, right? Pluralism, well, that's not entirely true, but prior to that, the big kind of pluralism on the table was articulated by Carnap. Even though I said Carnap wasn't a pluralist, this is what has been thought about in the literature, right? The big system, the big pluralism on the table is articulated by Carnap, and that is one where each logic comes with a distinct language. So connectives in different logics mean different things every time, and the pluralism in logic is generated by this kind of more basic linguistic pluralism, right? So here's a cool thing with this one, right? We can mess with purely the structural rules, maintain the meanings of our connectives across all of these different systems, and let them all in, right? We should, if things go according to plan, be able to get a relevant logic by omitting the weakening rules, right? If you drop these rules, the two of them, then you generate a relevant logic, or at least some sort of substructural logic, right? Still, the left and right logical rules remain the same, so the connectives are the same in all of the logics. Aha, says past Teresa.
Sorry, Teresa.
Yes.
Why is a nice picture by Restall should be an argument in favor of pluralism?
It's not. We are assuming pluralism is true and merely articulating one way why we can go about it. It's not. Restall is pretty explicit in the paper, in fact, that what he's doing is trying to provide a proof-theoretic version of the model theoretic pluralism that he and Beal articulate in the book.
Okay.
So the argument is in the book. It's based on the variety of models we can use in different places to do different things. And here we just are getting a proof-theoretic version of that. All right, here's the thing. If you read the sequent the way Restall says we need to read the sequent, then you effectively smuggle in the weakening, right? And this is entirely because of the meaning. We've basically defined the comma to be an and over here and defined it to be an or over here. So you can tack on whatever you want over here and still get the or stuff, or tack on whatever you want over here and still get it. Okay? So we sort of metalogically smuggle in the weakening rules, which means we can't really get a relevant logic on this picture. And Restall, of all the people, should want a pluralism with a relevant logic. He wrote a book on it. It's a big old book, right? In this paper, I look at a few other ways that you might accommodate this, including changing the meanings of the commas. But if you change the meanings of the commas for the relevant logic, then you have to change them for the other one too, because otherwise you mess with the meanings of the connective left and right rules. So it didn't totally work out. Okay, and that is effectively where am I now? I've lost track. My contribution to the debate ended, right? But that's not where we have to end, right? So Ferrari and Orlandelli show up and they say, actually, both Restall and, Kouri at the time, Kouri Kissel now, made a similar mistake, right? They both read too much model theory into the proof theory. The definition of the sequent here is talking about truth and evaluations, right? What are truth and evaluations but model theory? So they argue that if we can ditch that model theory and come up with a purely proof-theoretic reading of the sequent and a purely proof-theoretic admissibility condition, then we can do the thing that Restall wants, right? Which is to sort of articulate the view on Restall pluralism in a proof theory alone, and we can admit a relevant logic.
So a sequent is a connection between a conjunction and a disjunction, and it is
That's under Restall's reading, yeah.
No, but under
Orlandelli.
Well, this is what they say. So they say that the sequent gamma turnstile delta is the case if and only if the cases in delta follow from the assumptions in gamma. And y'all are going to ask me what a case is, and they basically roll with dice here. It's
Why not some cases in delta?
Hmm?
Not all the cases in delta follow from the assumption of gamma. Some cases of the.
You know, this probably has to do with what a case is. I'll have to look. So I thought I basically.
It seemed to me natural to say if some
It's going to
cases
be, yeah,
in delta follow from the assumption of gamma.
yeah,
No.
it's got to be some. Okay, I'm not totally sure what a case is. For them, it's a proof theoretic case. It's not going to be what I'm going to focus on today. If we want to pick on them for that, as well as what I'm going to pick on them for, I'm totally happy to do that. But I think there's really interesting questions that follow based on the definition of harmony they articulate, and so that's what we're going to focus on. Now, okay, so we get this new sequent reading. We no longer have to worry about the commas, right? Because we're just talking about cases following from assumption. Great. Okay. Look, there are two motivations that Ferrari and Orlandelli have here that are going to be really, really important for us throughout this, and I just want to make them like explicitly clear now, right? First is that they are motivated by...
Carnap was not tolerant. So what is it? Carnap was not tolerant. You explained that it was not pluralist.
He was pluralist, but he was tolerant.
Okay.
No. The Carnap thing is really interesting because you do wind up with a number of different logics. It's just he doesn't have a way to compare them, right? So anytime you ask the question, you have to say you're a monist, but you can ask it in different places and get different answers. But you can't tell they're different answers because you don't have a way to compare the places. It's very cool. Okay, so Ferrari and Orlandelli are motivated by Carnapian tolerance. Right? This is famous in my line of work quote, right? But in logic, there are no morals. Right? Everyone can build up his own logic or his own formal language as he wishes. All that's required of him is that if he wishes to discuss it, he's got to state his methods clearly and give syntactical rules instead of philosophical arguments. Right? You state your rules, you articulate your language, and you can do whatever you want with it. Right? In later work, Carnap suggests that what we want instead of ruling out logics is to basically, it's an almost instrumentalist picture, right? If the logic you're using does good work for you and helps you answer questions you're wanting to answer, then it's a good logic, right? Effectively, if it's useful, right, then we're good. And Ferrari and Orlandelli are going to adopt this kind of picture. For them, if a logic is useful, then it's one of the ones that we want to have included in our system. Okay? They explicitly endorse this in a quote I don't have here, but they explicitly endorse this in the paper, I promise, right? They also, though, want our logics to be balanced, right? So here is a worry. If we are merely now talking about cases and we're not concerned with what's true, right? Then we can define whatever rules we want as long as the cases that they generate follow from the assumptions on the other side, right? This could be a problem if we could generate a set of rules that was either...
Sorry, can you come back on the definition? So independently of a logic, what follow mean? What follow mean if we have not fixed the logic? The logic is a system of following. It is the logic is something that tells us what follow from what. So how can we speak about follow if we do not have a logic?
Well, we've got whatever rules. So when we say it turns the gamma turns out delta is true, we've got to do so with respect to some set. That
true is another story.
Yeah. The turnstile is defined by whatever rules the logic comes equipped with, and so it follows from if it follows from on the basis of those rules. That's probably going to get myself into hot water for that. But that's what I think that's what I've got to say for now. It follows from according to like whatever logic we're working in. But it's some sort of more intuitive version because you don't want this to wind up being circular. It's the meta logic.
Your proof system tells you what.
Yeah.
Follows. If it's provable in this sequence system, then
it follows from it.
That's.
Yes, but you change the logic, you change the follow.
Well, you just have to say how the proof system works based on your sequence, right? This is not, there is some variation there, but basically Jensen systems or any of these systems are syntactic systems and they don't need a semantics for them to work.
Yeah.
It's just like you have the turnstile, right? It's just like, okay, from all your resources in gamma, you can derive something in delta. Something.
This is clear. My problem is not that. The problem is that the notion of following is fixed by the logic itself.
Yeah.
It's not independent of the logic.
So they do talk about this, and I can't off the top of my head remember what they say about it. Right now, I'm gonna make a really unsatisfying move and say it's like some sort of informal notion that we've got that's like proof-theoretic, but don't think too hard about that because that's going to get real rough real quick. But yeah.
Okay, let's go.
Yeah. Okay. So we want our logics to be useful, but we also want them to be appropriate and balanced, right? We don't want them to sort of outstrip themselves or not be able to do enough, right? So one of the complaints that always comes up when I talk to people about how we want to admit useful logics to our system is like, okay, well, useful for what? What happens if my students in Introduction to Logic devise this logic where you can affirm the consequence? Yeah, affirm the consequence, right? This seems to me to be a bad logic, but it's also a logic that can approve too much. So Ferrari and Orlandelli at least have a way of it. You can also have logics that are too weak. This is going to be less of a concern for us here because we're concerned more with trivializing things than otherwise. But the solution they propose is meant to solve, right? So they're going to give one solution, one way to achieve this balance. I think it's basically they haven't incorporated enough things, and I'll tell you about that. Right? So for Ferrari and Orlandelli, then, a logic is admissible if we can read its sequence by the cases in delta follow from the assumptions in gamma, and its connectives are balanced. For them, the notion of balanced here is they base it on Belknap harmony. In fact, they say it's Belknap harmony, and it's not quite the harmony articulated by Belknap in that 1962 paper. But it's close, right? And certainly the Belknap version has a uniqueness and a conservativity requirement, and they've got that, right? So for Ferrari and Orlandelli, then the connectives need to be unique, which means that two notational variants of a connective need to be interderivable. And the logic itself needs to be conservative, right? So the rules for any given connective don't allow us to prove anything new about the language without that connective. Basically, any additional connective is going to be a conservative extension of the logic.
Sorry, just a basic question. According to this definition of admissibility, can you give an example of any inadmissible logic? Do you have like an example of any inadmissible logic?
We'll get there. If that's okay, if I can wait for like 3 more slides.
Okay.
Yes, is the answer.
Okay.
Okay. So now, this sort of summarizes Ferrari and Orlandelli's response to this whole thing. Given the rules from Westfield 2014, classical, intuitionistic, and relevant logic are all what we're going to call FO harmonious, right? They all have the notion of balance that Ferrari and Orlandelli want. They're unique in that two notational variants are interderivable, and they're conservative in that any additional connective is a conservative extension. So now we've got a proof-theoretic pluralism where the connectives mean the same thing. So we've achieved that same goal of the original Bjorn-Restall picture, but where we get all of the desired logics, because you can get irrelevant logic into this system, right? We're no longer sort of hampered by the commas being effectively classical, so we don't have to worry. They further argue that this is a 2-level pluralism, right? So we have a pluralism at the level of connective meanings, but they have a pluralism at the level of validity, because on this one system where we maintain all of the same operational rules, so those are the left and right rules for each connective, you can vary the structural rules in certain ways to generate all these different logics. But they also think that they have a pluralism at the level of the connective meanings too. So you could mess with the left and right logical rules and generate yet more sort of families that share connective meanings, but where we have different validity relations. Okay. All the admissible logics they argue are balanced and useful. So great. Okay, I want to focus on Ferrari and Orlandelli's notion of uniqueness now, in particular because I think it's sort of really, it's really strong. Right? So what we have for uniqueness is that if black circle is a notational variant of white circle, we must be able to show that those two connectives are interderivable. Right? What that means is we have to be able to prove that both of these sequences are in fact true. Right? We have to be able to prove that if we've got one on the left and the other on, then we have the other on the right, and then vice versa.
What is a notational variant exactly? What do you mean by notational variant?
For now, we're just going to roll with like everything looks the same except that the symbol involved, one symbol involved is different. The more I read about notational variants, the less I know what a notational variant is.
Because if I give a syntactical definition that is obvious by definition, if I give a semantic definition of the two values, the two tables are the same, then I go to match in the model theory.
Yeah.
So I do not understand what is notational variant.
Yeah, think of it as just like using a different symbol for the same thing. So I think.
Could we just not define it like this? Like the second item, could we just take this as a definition of notational variant?
We don't want to take it as a definition of a notational variant, because if you have a notational variant, then you have to be able to prove this holds. Sometimes you might have notational variants where it doesn't hold. For now, we're going to roll with a really like unfortunate claim. It's just like I know a notational variant when I see it. It looks similar enough. Mostly what I've done is just replace the symbols with another symbol, right? And you can only replace one of the symbols or like one of the symbols consistently. So yeah. Right, so here's what happens, right? If you've got, say, hook and arrow, with which both have the same rules, the same left and right rules, right? Then you can prove both of the desired sequence. You can prove A hook B turnstile A arrow B, and you can prove A arrow B turnstile A hook B. These are not super exciting proofs, right? You start with the identity sequence, which are just sort of there. And then in both cases, you do one of the L rules and then one of the R rules, depending on which direction you basically introduce it and then get rid of it, right? So it's not super exciting, and you can see maybe a bit of a better sense here of what we mean by notational variant. It's literally just like using a different shape for the connective. And on the proof-theoretic version of that, right, syntactically here, these do become really obvious. I don't know what to do when we get into the semantics of it, but for our purposes, the ones that matter are just the ones that we can see on the face of it, right? Okay. Here is another thing that they say, right? The rule of identity that expresses reflexivity, right? Basically, if A, then A. It's the rule that says for any sentence that basically A follows from the assumptions in A, which is too exciting. The rule of identity that expresses reflexivity has been used in proving the uniqueness of the operators, and we don't know whether it would be possible to prove uniqueness without it. So if we're going to adopt their notion of uniqueness, then we need to have an identity rule around, right? This would be unfortunate if it, say, required us to rule out some logics that were useful, right? So what I'm going to tell you about now will hopefully answer your question. It's a logic that's going to fail to be Ferrari and Orlandelli harmonious or balanced in this type of way. We might think it's good to keep around. So let me tell you about LKR. So French 2016, actually he followed up in a really cool paper in like later. I don't remember when, 2018, 2020 maybe, proposes that one method of resolving many of the paradoxes involving self-reference is to remove the identity rule, right? So let's think about what happens in logics where we drop that identity. This is, on the one hand, a kind of totally chaotic way to think, because like, A then A, right? But on the other hand, there might be some situations in which this kind of thinking could in fact be useful. Yeah.
For like in the sequent calculus written up earlier, the identity rule is the only axiom.
Mm-hmm.
So all proofs then would be
Yes.
couldn't be well founded. So how do you,
Give me one slide.
Because we're already commenting on it, like in domain theory, there are structures where you don't want to have the identity rule because you want to consider orders like way below, which are not reflexive.
Right.
And they still have a secret calculus.
Yes.
So I'm just wondering whether that could give more interesting examples.
Yeah. I don't know domain theory.
Yeah, I can tell you something.
I would love that.
Mhm.
I would love to make this less like a philosophical thought experiment and more of a thing that people actually do, right? Because here are the reasons I have why you might want to use this. French argues you can solve some paradoxes. You might want to say, instead of preserving truth across the secret, preserve a true in virtue of, right? A is not generally true in virtue of itself. It is maybe if it's an axiom, depending on how you think about it, but we wouldn't be able to adopt that as a general law. If you've got a heterogeneous logic, right, which is like a logic with one language on the left and a different language on the right, then A is not going to imply A, right? So there's a few times that this is actually good, maybe in domain theory, which would be great. Yeah, so if we are wanting to admit useful logics to our system, this seems like it might be useful. As Spencer noted, there are no valid sequence here, right? This is weird, but not too weird, because look, we've got plenty of valid meta sequence, so we can still talk about things going on in this logic. We just can't talk about them at the object level, right? So for French, then higher order, meta sequence are higher order sequence, which have sets of sequences, their premises, and sequences, their conclusion. A meta sequence, you can like do all of the same thing here, right? A meta sequence is valid if there's an LKR derivation whose end sequence is the conclusion and whose leaf sequence are all members of the premises, right? And here's an example of a valid meta sequence, right? You take P turnstile P, Q turnstile Q, and you can prove that P, Q, turnstile P, and Q is valid. That meta sequence is valid, right? Even though this end sequence here is not actually valid in LKR because LKR has no valids. So we can still do cool things in it, and we can still get things going. We just can't do them in the way that we usually do them. And importantly, LKR doesn't have rules that we can prove to be unique, right? We needed to start those proofs somewhere in order to prove those two sequences that we wanted to prove that we have unique rules. We can't here. It's just sort of, there's like nowhere to start those proofs. We can't even get the interderivability proofs off the ground. So it wouldn't, LKR then is one of these examples of a logic that's not going to be harmonious in the way that Ferrari and Orlandelli want. For them, it is unbalanced. Imbalanced? Unbalanced? It is not balanced, right? So it's not admissible by the lights of Ferrari and Orlandelli. Yeah.
I'm a little bit confused on how to read the meta sequence. Like, if I just kind of naively take the sequence here to be some version of an implication, then I still get like an identity, because any thing is going to still.
You'll get it at the meta sequence level.
Yeah.
Yeah, so you'll get like the sequence P turnstile P, big turnstile P, right? For sure. But that doesn't, so you get an identity kind of rule at the meta level, but you don't get it at the object level. And it's at the object level that we're doing all of this studying of things.
But nothing is true at the object level. Nothing's valid.
Nothing is valid at the object level. I thought this was going to be a less controversial talk than the one I gave about Carnap not being a pluralist, but maybe I'm just like destined to always be chaotic. Okay. So this is not admissible per the Ferrari and Orlandelli requirements of uniqueness, right? This would be a bummer. We could do cool stuff with it. Heck, we could even maybe do more cool stuff with it than I thought we could, right? We might want this type of system around. We had a particularly strong definition of uniqueness, right? We had to produce 2 proofs to be able to do that. So maybe if we weaken then the uniqueness proof, the uniqueness requirement, we might be able to admit this logic, which would be nice. So here is another version of uniqueness, which actually I think might be closer to the original Belknap version. But here we say instead of requiring the 2 things to be interderivable, that basically when you have a sequent containing one, you can derive the same sequent containing the other, right? So officially then, connective is unique if when you have a variant of it and you can derive a sequent containing the original, you could derive the same sequent with all instances of the original replaced by the notational variant. Okay. On this view, LKR is going to have unique connectives. Anytime you can derive a sequent containing one connective, you can derive the same sequent with all of the notational variant. Yay. We got it in, guys. We did the thing. This is great news, right? And it's interesting news because it effectively lets us generate yet another family of logics, right? So our original, like, Ferrari and Orlandelli picture, we had pluralism at the level of validity, where we had all the connectives meaning the same thing, and then we could muck with the connective rules a little bit and get a pluralism at the level of validity over there. So we have these 2-level pluralisms. Now maybe we've got a third way to muck with things, right? So we've got now, you know, connective and validity pluralism and a pluralism in the notion of uniqueness. We've got either a Ferrari and Orlandelli interderivability picture or this sort of like substitution picture. Okay. It's not clear that this definition of uniqueness is going to catch all of the useful logics out there. Yes.
Isn't that definition of uniqueness, though, going to just be vacuously true?
For LKR.
Yeah, because
Yeah.
you can't derive.
Yes.
Okay. So all things imply each other.
It's not going to be trivial.
Yeah.
Sorry. We had this in LKR, right? You've got no sequent containing. You can't ever derive a sequent containing the original connective.
Yeah.
So in that sense, it's factually true, but that doesn't mean that everything implies everything else.
Yeah.
Okay.
Everything implies that everything's interprovable.
Good. Everything's interprovable because there's nothing that can be proved. Yeah. You could probably duplicate something at the like meta-sequent level that would prove this in a more substantive way. I haven't tried it yet, but maybe that's something to do. Good. Even if we allow ourselves all of this chaos, that might not be enough to get us everything that we're looking for, right? I don't have a great example of other things that we might want, right? But you might think that a system with more than one notational variant of each connective, where those notational variants can't interact in any sort of substantive way, would be somewhere where you couldn't just replace one notational variant by another in a proof. I had toyed with a Hilbert style system with just duplicates of each connective to do this. But then it got too messy. So, but all things said, even if this doesn't work out, we've still got these 2 definitions of uniqueness on the table. And so we've still sort of kind of pushed the pluralism up yet another level. Okay. Look, is this still harmony? This is a really good question. I don't know if it's still harmony. Usually the folks in the harmony literature, when they're talking about the right definition of harmony or the right definition of uniqueness, what they're after is like an a priori picture of logic, where the right definition of uniqueness is going to be the single definition that is proven to be true in some sort of a priori method. This would certainly not allow for more than one definition of uniqueness to be reasonable. That's okay, though, Because what Ferrari and Orlandelli wanted was a sense of balance. They weren't so concerned that the logics were harmonious. In particular, they're not concerned to find like the one single a priori right logic because they're logical pluralists, right? So they don't need harmony per se. They just need some notion of balance. This second definition of uniqueness, where we're thinking in terms of intersubstitutability instead of interderivability, still gets us this notion of balance. So it's still close enough to harmony. Good. Okay. I don't think that's the only way to push this forward, right? We've mucked with the definition of uniqueness, but there are so many more definitions of harmony out there in the wild, right? We've got the Ferrari and Orlandelli one, right?
Remember, what is the definition of harmony?
For Ferrari and Orlandelli, you've got uniqueness, where that means that notational variants of connectives are interderivable.
And conservativity.
And you've got conservativity, yeah. So we've got that one now. We've got the sort of Ferrari and Orlandelli harmony where we swap in our notion of uniqueness, right? There's at least like the original Belknap version. There's a version that relies on normalization and a version that relies on general elimination harmony, right? All of these, right, are going to get at some notion of balance. So depending on exactly how we spell out what we mean by balance, we might be able to use some of these other versions of harmony to achieve that balance, right? So for Ferrari and Orlandelli, then remember, we want our logics to be useful and we want our logics to be balanced, right? And so here's a quote from Negri I find to be like a nice articulation of what we're looking for with harmony, and I think it appropriately characterizes what Ferrari and Orlandelli are looking for in a notion of balance, right? Whatever follows from the sufficient grounds for deriving a formula must follow from that formula, and whatever follows from a formula must follow for the sufficient grounds of deriving that formula, right? Basically, you want to be able to manipulate the symbols in your logic in such a way that you prove the right amount of things. You don't want to prove too much and you don't want to prove too little. Steinberger's 2011 paper, that's what harmony could and could not be, is also, it's just like this beautiful articulation of the ways you might think about harmony. But he also articulates something pretty similar, right? What we want from harmony is that our left and right logical rules are kind of appropriately balanced. Or if we're thinking in a natural deduction system, which we're going to switch to in just a second here, we want the intro and the lim rules for a particular connective to be balanced in the right kinds of ways, right? We don't want to kind of introduce too much or eliminate too little. Or even introduce too little and eliminate too much, right? We want them to be sort of peas in a pot. Yeah. And so if that's all we're after, she says, like that's a small ask, right? But if that's what we're after, then there's more ways to do that than just with uniqueness and conservativity, right? We can look, for example, at normalization. So if we're looking at a natural deduction system now instead of a sequent calculus, we can look at introduction and elimination pairs, right? If I introduce a sentence with a connective and then immediately eliminate it, it looks like that connective is not playing an important role. Okay? So an old philosophy professor of mine used to call these knees, knobbly knees. So it looks like it's this blip in the proof, right? It kind of spikes in the middle. If you're introducing it and then immediately eliminating it, there's no real reason it's there. And if you needed that to do the work, then something's gone wrong, right? You're somehow not balanced in the right kind of way because you needed to introduce and then eliminate a connective, and we don't really want that. And so what do we do to fix this? Well, we rewrite our proofs without the introduction and elimination pairs. Okay. So for each connective, then, what we wind up doing is we wind up generating a reduction procedure that tells us how to go from a proof that has one of these intros followed by an elim to a proof without one. And if you can reduce all of the proofs in a given system, then that system is said to be normalizable. Right. This is really easy to do for some connectives and really hard to do for others. And it's like super straightforward. You just get rid of it. But other things are harder. Obviously, arrows are a pain, and the quantifiers are like. But basically, what you wind up with is that a system is normalizable if you don't have any, if you can rewrite it such that you don't have any of these, kind of like these. Was that a question? Yeah.
Yeah, I'm wondering about if it's not like you're just introducing and then eliminating, if you have like in an introduction and then you do some stuff and then you eliminate it, is that still, if you're not using it in the time between? That's still considered.
There are results about this, and I don't have them immediately. You know, I gave this talk about a month ago and someone was like, Teresa, you forgot about exactly this, and then told me the answer to it, and now I've totally lost it. I think it's going to depend on exactly what you think your reduction procedure is. So certainly the immediate ones have to go for everyone. Those intermediate ones, so basically it's going to turn out that classical logic is not normalizable on this strict. This is a Dummett picture, so he's like looking to justify an intuitionistic logic. So classical logic is not going to be normalizable in this particular way, but there are ways to adjust it that makes classical logic normalizable. And I'm wondering if the like distance between the elimination matters. I think it doesn't. I think it's the same thing no matter what. But I'm not 100% sure. I'll have to look. Thank you though. Sorry, I'm going to write it down. Okay. So then here's another way how we might achieve balance, right? You might think if you don't sort of have any of these spikes or introductions followed by eliminations, then your introduction and elimination rules are kind of balanced in the right way because they prove the right kinds of things in the right kinds of ways. Interestingly, normalization and for the FO harmony we've been talking about with like their interderivable unibility version of uniqueness and conservativity do come apart. Right, so reductio can be leveled in that you can write a procedure. There's a reduction procedure that exists for it, but it's not conservative when you add it to classical logic, right? So we can then get more useful and balanced logics in this way. Oh, and here's the system that I was looking for in the seminar yesterday, right? If we add regular disjunction to a system with quantum disjunction and conjunction, right, that's going to not be a conservative extension, but it will be normalizable, right? And you might think that a system with quantum disjunction, conjunction, and regular disjunction would be useful for some purposes. I don't know. One could make an argument about that. We're philosophers. There's got to be an argument out there for that. So we might be able then to admit more useful logics by expanding our notion of balance in this way, which would be pretty cool. Okay, but we have this same question again. Is this still harmony? Well, it's the same answer from last time. It doesn't totally matter, right? Ferrari and Orlandelli don't really care whether it's harmony. They care whether these systems are appropriately balanced. This is certainly another way to achieve that balance, right? More controversially, we might think that this does suggest we have multiple correct notions of harmony. If all harmony is supposed to capture is some notion of balance, then the fact that this isn't like the a priori definition shouldn't necessarily rule it out as being like a genuine version of harmony. This would mean, though, that harmony is not at all like the literature expects, which would put me back in the crazy boat with Marco and Frege not being a logicist. I'm not sure I want to jump in there today. I've already told you that like A doesn't imply A, so maybe that would be too much. But it doesn't really matter, right? We've got this notion of balance still, which is really what we were after in the first place. So whether this is a genuine notion of harmony or just some sort of notion of balance that is out there, we can go either way.
But when you introduce balance, you say that not to prove too much and not to prove too little.
Yeah.
But this is not a very clear criterion. What does it mean too much? What does it mean too little?
This is a great question. If you're asking me, it's going to be sort of dependent on what you're up to. Sometimes it's going to be dependent on what you're up to. But this is a very pluralist and very Carnapian answer, right? I want to know what goal you've got, and then I'm going to be able to tell you better when you're doing too much, when you're sort of outstripping your resources, and when you're proving too little. For the harmony people, this is why they're after an a priori thing, right? They want like the definition that's going to help them sort of rule them or limit themselves to exactly one logic. This is not how they're going to describe it, right? It makes it sound like they're like looking for this notion of harmony that sort of does the work of ruling out all the other logics for them, but it's more the other way around, right? They find the right logic and then find that it is in harmony. The connectives are harmonious, or the logic is harmonious. These are also sort of subtly different. Okay. Right. So everything admitted, then if we think about this, let's let in LKR, let's let in that quantum system is still going to be balanced and useful, which means that Ferrari and Orlandelli should want it in their system, right? So now what we've got on the table instead of their original 2-level system is a 3-level system. We've got a pluralism at the level of validity, at the level of connective meanings, and then again at the level of like what constitutes balance system. Which would be great. I want to just take the last few minutes to talk about the original Beal and Restall requirements and show how this meets those requirements in the same way that the Ferrari and Orlandelli system does, right? The original one with just their one notion of uniqueness. Right. So the worries that I proposed in that 2016 paper still don't apply because there are at least some places where you get irrelevant logics for some notions of harmony, like say the one that Ferrari and Orlandelli proposed, get a relevant logic on the table. So that's great. And then the other 3 requirements that Ferrari and Orlandelli have are that the logic be necessary, that it be normative, and that it be formal. Okay. So a logic is necessary when it's the kind of relation between premises and conclusions that occurs solely in virtue of the characteristics that are intrinsic to the deductive system in use and thus entirely independent of further extra logical hypotheses that we may entertain and which are external to the system. Right? I think we're still good on this front. Yeah, we've not let in any extra logical things into our considerations here. We've been thinking purely in terms of logical things. And certainly when we look at the systems we've developed, if the Ferrari and Orlandelli systems are necessary, then this system is necessary. Right? And this definition they give is based on the definition from Beal and Restall. I also think...
So it means the necessity change from logic to logic.
Because the definition of necessity doesn't involve because it's a weird definition of necessity, and I think that's important, right? So it's the relationship holds in virtue of the characteristics that are intrinsic to the deductive system and that are independent of extra logical.
You change the deductive system and you change the necessity.
Yeah, because then you're changing what's intrinsic to the deductive system.
But what is the difference between necessity and consequence?
Oh, so here, listen, necessity is wild on this picture, isn't it? Because you've got like all of these necessary logical relations, but they might be telling you different things about particular sets of things. This is what Ferrari and Orlandelli say. So if I can get the system I've developed now to meet that, then it's at least as good as theirs, right? And we've shown that they needed to push their system farther and not just remain content with one notion of uniqueness. It's a chaos definition of necessity, though, because it's not that the notion of necessity is going to change from logic to logic, but what things are necessary is totally dependent on the logical system that you're considering. Which is very strange. Usually we think necessity is like a totally external thing, and it won't. I mean, it's necessary. It's not going to change no matter what you do, right? But here instead what we wind up with is a bunch of different relationships that are all necessary. And some people like characterize this by thinking of logics about different domains. So in this domain, like whatever is necessary, and in another one it's not. Beal and Restall don't, but
it's very useful for you, Ben, this definition of necessity, because in the way it's very easy to say that mathematics is necessary.
Maybe too easy.
Too simple.
Yeah.
It's too easy. With this definition of necessity, mathematics is certainly a necessity, but it seems to me a little bit too easy.
It's going to make a lot of things necessary.
Exactly.
Right.
So what would be an example of an extra logical hypothesis?
I don't know.
I suppose outside the system.
Outside of the system, or about like, you know, what my favorite color is if I wanted to like
But I mean, this would seem like so unusual to me that I wouldn't even know why I would have to exclude it.
Yeah.
So there are no interesting logics which are not necessary.
That is correct.
Okay.
Uh,
So this is not actually excluding anything interesting.
I haven't found anything interesting that it's excluding. Basically, if you have a logic, it is going to be necessary.
Okay.
And I think actually this is a criticism of the original Bjornstad book too, that the notions of necessary, normative, and formal that they develop apply to any logic you generate. They're not excluding anything interesting. Here, let me show you normativity. For our logic to be normative, if an argument is valid, then you go wrong if you accept the premises but reject the conclusion. You somehow go wrong. But like there's a very obvious way in which you go wrong because you've gone against whatever logic you're working with. Right? So again, this is one where it's really hard to see what types of things are not going to fit that.
Mm-hmm.
This one is maybe more interesting. Sorry, I'll be right there. This one is maybe more interesting because of some recent work that Gillian Russell has done where she argues that logic is not normative at all, even in this kind of way. So there's at least like some controversial stuff here, but it's actually Gillian and Chris Blake Turner together, I think. But it's like all three of these are going to turn out to be really weak notions. Yeah.
Yeah. So when we went back to Carnap's original definition of a logic, where he said it's just like rules you can write down. Like, what if my logic has like various omega rule stuff in it, and like these ideas of like almost needing a model itself, like then the rules themselves are kind of dependent on your background model, and I don't feel like.
So for Carnap's original picture, it's all syntactic. There are no background models. There are no models.
Yeah, but like if I specified the axioms of set theory first,
sure,
and then I went and wrote down my laws of logic using those axioms, then I have a whole.
Yeah. Go to 10. I'm not seeing the problem. For Carnap, this is totally fine. You can go hang out and do your thing as long as when someone asks you what you're doing, you can explain it to them with syntactical rules and not philosophical arguments. Because it's not like we're looking for the right logic here, right? We're just looking for logics that are good for particular purposes. But maybe I'm missing the point.
Yeah, I'm just feel like there's some like if there are multiple different models for my logic, like under certain ideas it could prove something, or it couldn't prove something. Like it doesn't feel like it's always necessary. Maybe I'm.
So Carnap doesn't have this. This is the necessary normative and formal requirements are not Carnap's. His are just like you list your syntactic rules and tell me about them, right? So if you've got different models proving different things, then that's totally fine. Okay, we can still make mistakes though on all the logics that we've talked about, so that's totally fine. And then the last requirement that they have is a requirement of formality. So Ferrari and Orlandelli use this definition, in which according something is formal is if it an operator is logical, sorry, not formal, if it can ultimately be analyzed in structural terms, right?
What do you mean by structural terms?
Well, so it's logical if it represents some structural element of deduction, meaning that it okay, look, here's the deal. No one really knows what formal means, right? It's another one of these silly, like I know it when I see it. In the book, Beal and Raskol give 4 different definitions of formal, right? And they don't actually settle on one. Here Ferrari and Orlandelli have to switch to something that's more proof-theoretic instead of model-theoretic, but what they say is that it's logical if it represents some structural element of deduction. So if you can think about it as like shaping the picture of the logic, which is not super helpful because we've talked a lot now about structural versus operational rules. And if you think about things as structural in that sense, then that's not quite right, but we can, it gives shape to the logic in a way. Sequent calculus rules all have this property, right? So we're good to go for LKR. We will need to change this if we want to include a kind of normalization picture, right? Because that works for natural deduction systems, or I've got here Hilbert as an example. But you can basically think of them as like giving shape to something. This is a very vague way to say it, but I don't have much better. There's a lot of work on this. McFarland has a really cool paper about different notions of formality. He's also got a really cool paper about different notions of normativity. Okay, where does that leave us then? Well, now we have a pluralism at the level of validity. Ferrari and Orlandelli argue that there may be one at the level of connective meanings, and we've added another one at the level of admissibility. So our logics are now admissible if they meet any of our definitions of uniqueness or any of our definitions of balance, right? So both of those notions can generate a plurality as well. That's all I've got.
Okay, questions? Peter.
Yeah, I'm wondering, thanks for the interesting talk, but does it include things like substructural logics where you're not necessarily commutative?
Yeah, it will. So the way that the sequence is written right now, it does necessarily commute, but there's ways to adjust. In fact, it's Greg Restall who has the really cool book on this. There's ways to adjust it so that you can prevent it from being commutative, and this would be another structural change. So you wouldn't be changing the operational rules. And of course, there's reasons to think that when you make these sort of substantive structural changes that you are in fact impacting the operational rules a little bit because you're saying what can and can't go in various places of them. But yeah, at least on this picture specifically, we can get in a lot of these really cool substructural logics just by mucking with the structurals.
Thanks.
When you're talking about conservativity by adding new connectives, is that equivalent to like the sub-formula property in the sequent calculus? Because I don't see how one connective can affect another if you only have like their introduction.
It can't, partly by design, right? What is it? Reductio is the one that's not conservative, right? So if you, I never remember which way that goes. You prove something can't happen, then you can introduce the negation. No, the other way around. Sorry. It's partly by design that because the way that the sequent calculus is written is just such that it you can't really get into anything with anything else, right? But there are places where this is more contested. So what you have to do is basically take the fragment of the logic without the connective you're interested in, see what you can prove there, add the new connective, and see if you prove anything in the old language.
So this implies the conservativity, but the conservativity doesn't necessarily imply this?
Yeah, there are more things that are conservative than just the system, but this is a conservative system.
Like, can all conservative systems be written in a sequent calculus that has this sub-object?
Ooh, I have no idea.
There's logics which cannot be written sequent calculus.
Yeah.
Probably.
I assume they're, yeah.
Just like they don't have this formal, like, because you would need, like, there's always a question how much structure you need, so what we still call sequent, right? But there's these substructural logics where you can prove that you cannot do sequence and you start doing hypersequence, then you prove that you cannot do hypersequence, and then you have to do something else. So there's things like that. I don't know when conservativity comes in.
It's about the adding of the thing, right? Yeah.
Other questions? Okay, so to me, the idea here is that we want to be pluralist, but not too much. It is, so to say, we want to be pluralist, but only admit the good logics.
Yeah.
And then the problem here concern what makes a logic good. So in what make a logic good is taken for granted what make a logic a logic. So we know what a logic is. It is a system of what is a logic. Here, by the way, is first question. What is a logic here? Is propositional calculus with the usual 5 connective? If I introduce model, operator, quantifier, lambda calculus, epsilon Hilbert calculus, this is logic, or logic is simply propositional calculus with the 5 connectors?
No, so it depends on who you ask, of course. If you ask me, and I'm not.
No, I asked to them, or to you too, to you.
So yes, those are all.
Sorry?
Huh? Those are all logics.
So, no,
For me, yes.
for you
all count.
what, sorry?
They all count. They're all logics.
Or they are all logic.
Sure.
And
Son lógicas, de acuerdo con ello.
but then this criterion is are very difficult to generalize to system.
Which ones?
The criterion that.
No.
So it seems like here logic is simply propositional calculus.
Okay.
With the usual connector.
Yeah, an important distinction. So in this picture, in the picture that Ferrari and Orlandelli paint, right, they are focused exclusively, I mean, they don't even consider the normalizability stuff because that's in a natural deduction instead of in a sequence calculus. So for them, in this paper, a logic has to be the type of thing that you can symbolize in a sequence calculus, generally the type of thing that has these connectives, although they admit that there's many different families of connective meanings, so you might be able to switch that. But for this paper that they write, that's definitely the case. It's got to be something, at least in a sequence calculus, maybe with different connectives. So like, let's get linear logic in with like multiple whatevers. It's going to go in a different family of logics from the usual classical intuitionistic and relevant, but it can be part of the game nonetheless.
But other connective, what does it mean? Other connective, other tables, or we can introduce a trivalent connective. So what does it mean, other connective?
Just think like an intentional. If I wanted to add an intentional and or something like that to this, or an intentional or instead of the purely extensional ones, or some of the linear logics do some strange things with negation, right? They kind of generate a number of negation connectives. You could do that here too. It's just you would shift yourself to a different family of logics.
And if I say that the following, a logic is admissible, a derivation system is admissible if and only if it does not admit explosion.
Right.
But why should I require more that avoid explosion? I do not understand why should I admit more if I am pluralist.
Yeah.
Of course, I do not want explosion because otherwise, okay.
Yeah.
But why should I admit more than
just the things that aren't trivial? Okay. Here I'll embody who was I was talking to somebody yesterday about logical anarchy. I really think that the right choice here, and I have not defended this in any way in this talk or in print anywhere, but like the right choice is to just let all the logics in. Whatever you want, you can have it, do your stuff with it. It's just you can't make other people use it, right? If they also find it useful, they might pick it up and take it.
So like explosion, because otherwise you can use anything and that is not okay.
But sometimes I think my intro to logic students are like, oh yeah, I'm gonna just use explosion all over the place, and they have all these inferences that they conclude by explosion, and I'm like, well, that's not at all how it works. But like, they're in their own intro logic land. Maybe that's a good logic for them. It's not a good logic to get an A.
Logic is a good logic for them. Paraconsistent logic is not a good logic for them, and for you. For them, is a paraconsistent logic satisfy the relevant logic satisfy it.
Yeah.
But relevant logic is only one among many different paraconsistent logics.
Be a paraconsistent one gets right. So some of them do. She says, not confidently at all. I don't know that all of them do, but I also think like, so my own opinion, like this aside, I think if it's a logic that you can do cool stuff with it, like do the cool
It
stuff.
seems to me a very communist pluralism. I am pluralist and democratic, but only if you agree with me.
This is, you know, if more things work that way.
Yeah, I know. I was for a long time in my life in the Communist Party, so I know what is the communist pluralism.
But yeah, so here we have a pretty restricted picture, right? For Ferrari and Orlandelli, it's got to be presentable in a sequent calculus. It's got to have these particular connective rules involved. It's got to be the type of thing that's unique and conservative. I think these are limitations that, like.
Other questions?
I have a question. So I not so long ago, I read a little bit about what they called the adoption problem.
Mm-hmm.
And it was papers by Berman, but also a paper by Kripke.
Yeah.
And now thinking back to that, I don't think I mentioned raster and logical pluralism at all. But that's a bit curious, actually. So
I know
that
the adoption problem is.
Yeah, that you're so in this one paper, for example, Kripke argued you are not free to adopt a logic.
Right.
So it was like looking from your talk now, an argument against logical pluralism.
Yeah.
Right. But so now it looks to me like there are these kind of two kind of sub-communities which are not referencing their work. It seems like that if you look from a big picture point of view, they're discussing the same problem. So I'm just curious about what your take is on that.
You know, I don't really have one. I don't know the adoption problem well enough. I know there's a ton of literature on it. I know Kripke was involved, and the folks in Argentina are really excited about it. But that's about where my knowledge of it ends. So I don't have a take, but I think you're right that maybe I should have a take.
You should have a take, right?
Yeah.
So and actually, I would be personally interested in what your
take is like, well, so I'm gonna get myself in all kinds of trouble. So much of what Kripke says I find totally confusing. And the like my initial instinct is like, well, he thinks you're not free to adopt a logic. What? I don't. Maybe that's right. Maybe that is it like something about how our brains are wired?
No, I think it's the following,
or is it? It's like
it has to do what we call logical frameworks in computer science.
Okay.
And kind of logical frameworks are about the minimal logic you need to have to even do logic.
Good.
So it's kind of the logic you need on the meta level. And so it's essentially it's a universal instantiation and it's modus ponens and maybe or not a rule for conjunction. So basically just the basic machine you need to do symbol manipulation. So like what you need to even talk about a formal system.
Yeah.
And so that's my interpretation of these papers, because they don't say it like this, but they always use these same three rules when they say you're not free to
This is good because they're this type of thing. So maybe I just don't know it under the name of adoption problem, but this type of thing does come up, right? What is, so say you're a pluralist, what is the like shared core of all of the logics, right? And why aren't we just talking about whatever that is?
So for example, if you look at these rules that Raster has up there, he needs something like modus ponens, that's the horizontal line.
Mm-hmm.
And then he needs something like conjunction, that's the white space between the sequence.
Yeah.
And then he needs something like universal instantiations, because the A's and the B's are meta variables.
Yeah. Yeah, no, this is interesting. So Beal, actually, of the Beal and Restall, has recently sort of disavowed pluralism in favor of a super weak minimal logic. So he's been advocating lately for FDE.
And does he refer to researching computer science? Because like we have this notion of logical frameworks dating back to the 70s or something, or maybe even longer.
Yeah, but there's also no reason on this type of view that you couldn't still be a logical pluralist, even if you think you need these three.
Yeah, no, exactly. So that was my question also. Like, I mean,
there are folks that where you have a conditional that doesn't detach, right? So where you don't have modus ponens for all the arrows involved. Are there folks without a conjunction introduction? I doubt it. But yeah, if you think maybe you need like some minimal core, this would answer Marco's question about what a logic is. It's the type of thing that has this minimal core, and then you build on top of that. That could be,
And we know exactly what this minimal core has to be, it needs to be enough to implement a Turing machine. And then we can talk about like how precisely we lay this out, but that's what we need.
This is something similar to the argument that I remember that you advanced this argument once in the restaurant, that you needed to have at least modus ponens or something.
Yeah, this was that was when I was reading those papers, and that was why we talked about it in the restaurant at the time. Yes,
but then I was thinking about it. And now, here my objection.
Mm-hmm.
Your argument is to say, I need modus ponens because in any case, whatever the logic is, has some rules, and I have to know that if these circumstances apply, and if the rule is valid, if circumstances apply, then I have something. This is generally speaking form of modus ponens. I agree with that, but this means that we need modus ponens at the level of meta level, not necessarily in the system itself.
There's all these interesting.
You can have a system without modus ponens.
Even here you can have, of course, but on the meta level you need to.
The meta level is another thing.
If you're using modus ponens on the meta level, in a certain sense, you're admitting that it's true. And if you have any connection between
at the meta level,
exactly, the question of logic is not truth. The question of logic is derivation.
No, but the meta level stuff is a really interesting question on this literature, because if you're arguing that there's more than one correct logic, then you have to answer these really weird questions about like what logic are you arguing that there's more than one correct logic in. And so there's all these meta level questions. Actually, I'd be interested, and I'll take a look. I wonder if anyone's ever suggested that like you've got all these different object level pluralisms, and then what you need at the meta level is just some logic that satisfies the adoption problem things, right?
Mm-hmm.
So you've got
can we have pluralism at the meta level? Maybe that's the more interesting question.
I'm sure. Yes, in fact, I think I have a paper where I articulate that you should have pluralism at the meta level.
Okay.
But it's a like kind of a lot of my work is based on stuff Carnap. It's like a kind of niche Carnap point. But,
so Kripke cites Carnap in some of his papers.
Right. Okay. I'll have to take a closer look. I just don't know that literature well enough at all. Aside from knowing that people care about it.
Other questions, Peter?
No, I like this idea of pluralism at the meta level.
It's plural. By my lights, it's pluralism all the way up. You pick the logic that works wherever you are on this hierarchy.
Study it, you have to have another meta level. Why not?
Well, and it's interesting too, because a lot of the meta level choices you make sometimes sort of trickle down to the object level choices, right? So the entailment guys, Anderson and Belknap, actually, have this really interesting, they're also hysterical to read, by the way, but they have this really interesting section where they talk about the fact that you can admit disjunctive syllogism at the meta level, and it does sort of trickle down into the object level, right? And they talk about a dog getting to a fork in the road and then going one way because they didn't smell the other way and not even bothering to smell it, and say that they must be more foolish than the dog or something like this. But yeah, it's interesting, and there's like things that you can do at the meta level that also kind of trickle down in intuitionistic logic as well. So anytime you've got like a stronger meta logic than your object logic, things have a tendency to like appear, which is a weird kind of feature. So you do have to be quite careful. But I wonder if we take something super weak up there that wouldn't be stronger than most things that you'd be wanting to consider. Oh, it's an interesting, yeah, I'll have to think more about it, but thank you.
Okay, I think that we should evaluate at this point whether the logic of the Thai restaurant is a good logic or not.
It is.
Okay, so thank you, Teresa. Thank you.